Welcome back to our latest episode through our little series discussion, thinking around what it looks like to be a person of faith or follower of Jesus in 21st century modern Western culture. And if you've been joining with us, my name's James. I'm here in the north of Tasmania, part of the All Saints Network. You can go back to episode 1 for all the deets about that and what we're doing and who we are. But fundamentally, this series is really designed not for me to be original, not for us to build a channel. We're drawing mostly from other people, but to kind of unpack their thinking and be helpful. That's our fundamental aim, to be helpful and engage with philosophers and cultural commentators in the Bible, trying to understand and make sense of the world that we live in. And we based that on an exploration of, very brief exploration of Charles Taylor's thoughts around his 2007 book, A Secular Age. And so we've been on this journey, this arc of trying to understand the culture that we live in, a pain-pleasure worldview, thanks to David Williams, I think, for coining that phrase, and thinking through what it looks like then to live in a world where the supernatural, where God is out there. If he exists at all, great if he does, but he's out there. He's kind of irrelevant because making the most of our lives, making the most of ourselves, discovering our meaning and purpose in this day and age is found within, right? So we've talked about living under a dome and God being out there and meaning making happening within us. Last episode, we talked about a new paradigm. We looked at one half of that, a suffering glory paradigm, which is the paradigm of the worldview, of the lens of making sense of the world and making the most of our lives, which I think is expressed in the Bible through Jesus, and how that contrasts to a pain-pleasure worldview where we run away from pain and we run towards pleasure. We looked at that being a great forgery. So suffering, as opposed to pain, is a means by which we engage and lay down our lives and give of ourselves to the world, to God, to those around us. And that's actually the pathway through to meaning making, ultimate satisfaction, purpose, meaning, which the Bible describes as glory, the honor and respect and delight of God, the one from whom all things emanate. So kind of the takeaway, or where we left it last time, was this idea that this suffering glory paradigm actually gives greater fullness to my life, in part because it points to something bigger than me, something outside of myself. And what a lot of people seem to miss is when you focus on glory, which is chiefly found in the honor and greatness of Jesus, when you live your life in an other person-centered way, with Jesus being an other, and then those around you, your neighbors, your friends or family being other, when you make Jesus' glory, his greatness and honor your chief aim, and that's expressed through the way in which you love those around you, you in fact paradoxically receive glory. You receive honor and fullness and greatness in and of yourself, the very thing that your heart is looking for. It comes by focusing outward, not by trying to make it from within. So C.S. Lewis, one of the 20th century greatest Christian thinkers, he writes this. He said this of Christianity, and I'm quoting this. He said, "If we consider the promise of rewards and the staggering nature of the rewards promised in the Gospels, it would seem that our Lord Jesus finds our desires not too strong, but too weak. We are half-hearted creatures fooling around with drink and sex and ambition when infinite joy is offered us. Like an ignorant child who wants to go on making mud pies in a slum because he cannot imagine what is meant by the offer of a holiday at the sea," he finishes with this: "we are far too easily pleased." And according to Lewis, the thing that we don't emphasize enough is the weight of our own glory. the fullness of your glory. That you and I, we were created to give and receive glory, honor, respect. We are to be lifted up and exalted. You are a glorious creature. So glory is the reward and destiny of following Jesus, according to Jesus. And pleasure, which is this worldview that we primarily operate in as secularized people, running away from pain, running towards pleasure. Pleasure itself is actually a signpost to glory. At best, it's a shadow. It points to something more. So what is our glory? What is our glory? That's a great question. And to answer that, writer Ryan Hawkins puts it this way. He says, our getting glory is a receiving of transformational praise, honor, and recognition from God. And I think those words, praise, honor, and recognition, they're really fitting because this is a large part of what constitutes the idea of glory. But the word transformational is needed as well. For the glory that we receive, this greatness and praise and honor and recognition actually changes us. And it continues to change us forever because it comes from God. And in both cases, in the praise and in the change itself, the transformation, it is glory that we get from God. So there's two aspects to our glory. We receive recognition from God and we receive change from God. We're gloriously changed as we receive this recognition and this praise and this honor from God. It changes us. I think last episode I used the example of receiving praise from a parent or a school teacher. In fact, just this week, as we prepare to head overseas for a time, Karen and I were meeting with the teachers for our kids at school to try and work out what they need to do while we're away. And my wife, she took our eldest to a little meeting with her school teacher. And fundamentally, they said, look, you need to focus on your journal writing and your math, etc. And they had this great discussion. And the teacher said to Anna Laura, you are a fantastic writer. So writing for you, it should be something you practice, but you're really good at that. And Anna Laura was stunned. She couldn't believe it because, I don't think she's ever considered herself a great writer. And she came out of that interview and she was buzzing. And hours later, I got home from work, and the first thing she wanted to tell me was that her teacher told her that she was a great writer. And she said, I've got my assignments, and I looked at my assignments, and I've got B's, and I've got A's, and I think maybe I am a great writer. And the very next morning, she slept overnight, she came into the bedroom, and she was still buzzing. Oh, I'm a great writer. That piece of praise, that recognition, I think has changed Anna Laura. It's changed how she sees herself. She now sees herself as someone who might be a great writer. It's changed her attitude towards writing, not something that she was particularly looking forward to, but now really looking forward to. It's even changed her attitude towards going away for a few months. She was worried about missing school for several months. I know what kid would be upset at missing school for several months. I think she might get that from my wife. But now she's free to go. She can't wait. She's engaged. I think largely because of this piece of praise, this piece of recognition from her teacher. She was honoured in the conversation. And that changed her. It was transformational. Just a very small example. When you live for pleasure and avoid pain, I think there's something of coming close to grasping what life is meant to be. As we said in an earlier episode, it's a gospel. It's a good news. It's a good news that says you can have the pleasure and avoid the pain. And let's be honest, if I was to walk out into the street and take a survey, who would like to avoid pain? Who would like more pleasure in their lives? I can't think of a single person that would say no. I mean, I would say yes to that. Imagine going around saying, no, I want less pleasure and I want more pain, right? It makes no sense. But this good news, this this ideal that somehow we can live our lives maximizing pleasure and avoiding pain turns out to be false. It's a false gospel. It's untrue good news. It's not real because it can't deliver. Even in the West, even with, I live in Australia, and even with all our wealth and privilege, we can get close, we can approximate it, we can use our wealth to insulate us from pain, we can use our wealth to buy insurance in case everything goes bad, we can rebuild. But even for us, we can't avoid pain. Our family members still pass away. Relationships still break down. We're still afflicted with illness, increasingly more and more with mental illness. Like pain is a part of our lives. It can't deliver. It says, this good news of our culture says it's on you to make it happen. Here's the utopia, more pleasure, less pain, but it's on you to make it happen. You've got to make it work. Which frankly, at least in my experience, is impossible. It gives a vision of a kingdom, an incredible kingdom, a kingdom of pleasure, a kingdom where there's no pain, no more tears, where we can live our best lives. But it tries to make it without a king. I think Mark Sayers made that idea famous or popular. And in the version of the gospel that the Bible puts forward, it says there is a kingdom, there is something you can attain to, there's something greater than even pleasure, there's something transformational called glory, but you can't do it without the King, you can't do it without Jesus. You can't do it without the one from whom all glory and goodness and pleasure comes from. Our glory, this is the transformational praise and honor and recognition, is wrapped up in the pleasure and praise of God towards us. Peter, one of Jesus' followers, he writes in a letter in 2 Peter 1:17, he writes this, he says in verse 17, he received honor and glory from God the Father when the voice came to him from the majestic glory saying, this is my Son, whom I love. With him I am well pleased. Jesus receives the praise and pleasure of his Father continually, eternally, and Jesus in turn delights in the Father. But even when Jesus was on earth as a man walking and eating and doing his ministry, there's a moment in the Gospels, in the biographies of Jesus early on in his ministry where he's baptized. And his cousin John the Baptist, Jesus comes to him and says, baptize me, baptizer. And John's like, oh no, I'm not worthy to baptize you. You should be baptizing me. And Jesus says, no. I want you to baptize me. And so John does. And as he baptizes him, God the Father speaks out of heaven. And Peter catches this in verse 17 here. This is my Son with whom I'm well pleased. Jesus is experiencing the delight and pleasure of his Father. And this is before he's even fulfilled or finished the work that God has given him to do. This is at the beginning. God wants him to know. His Father wants him to know. I'm proud of you, boy. I'm proud of you, my son. Here's my pleasure. Here's my goodwill. Here's my delight. Let me just pour it on you. You need to know this. You need to know how I feel about you. And as Jesus receives the good pleasure and praise of his Father towards him, so do we. Let me pick up again C.S. Lewis. He says this in a sermon that he gave. It's in a book called The Weight of Glory, one of C.S. Lewis' most famous sermons. He writes this: the promise of glory is the promise, almost incredible and only possible by the work of Christ, that some of us shall find approval, shall please God. To please God, delighted in as an artist delights in his work or a father in a son. It seems impossible, a weight or burden of glory which our thoughts can hardly sustain, but so it is. What C.S. Lewis is saying is that it's genuinely possible to bring delight and pleasure to please God, the King of the universe, the creator of the cosmos, the unchanging changer, the one from whom all life and goodness flows. So C.S. Lewis, this is extraordinary. The fact that we, as humans, that we could live in such a way that brings God pleasure, that just by being us, God might delight in us. Really, we please God genuinely now and forever simply because we're His, because we belong to Him, and we can enjoy His good pleasure for us. That's the receiving of glory, the enjoying of His good pleasure, His delight towards us. We're made to receive and to reflect glory. Ultimately, we're made to receive and reflect His glory. So we not only receive glory from God in the form of praise and honor and recognition now, but especially in the future, but we also receive Christ's transformative glory now and forever. As we receive the glory of Jesus, we're changed by it. And this glory, this honor and praise, this delight and this love from God is so huge, it's so extraordinary, and it's so wonderful that to experience God's good pleasure, to experience His praise, is to be changed by it, is to be transformed by it. We are transformed into creatures of even greater glory. We're changed into the people that we will be with God forever in His kingdom. Writes the Apostle Paul in 2 Corinthians 3:18, we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. So we focus on the honor and praise, the goodness and beauty of Jesus, Christ's glory. That's what it means to focus on Christ's glory, to focus on the praise, the lifting up, the honoring, and the goodness and the beauty of Jesus. But as we do that, says Paul, that actually leads us to being changed from one degree of glory to another, from one degree of likeness to Jesus to another. And one day we will be, the words are, fully glorified. That is, one day we will receive the fullness of God's delight and praise in us. But right now, the promise is that we're being changed. We're becoming more and more glorious for those of us who focus on the honor and praise, the goodness and beauty of Jesus. And from Romans 5, and that's another letter that Paul wrote in the New Testament, this actually becomes the thing we boast in. This becomes our great prize. This is the treasure. Says Paul, we boast in the hope of the glory of God. Not only so, but we also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. I think we know, if we're honest with ourselves, that pleasure on its own, it won't satisfy us, not ultimately. And that no matter how hard I try, and we do try pretty hard, we actually can't avoid pain. And the message or the good news of Jesus, it tells me that I was made for more than pleasure. It tells me I was made for glory, for the praise and honor and recognition that comes from God, His delight in me. And that happens as we reflect the glory of God Himself, as we receive God's glory. And this doesn't mean that I deny my suffering or my pain, Rather, it's a paradigm, a framework of seeing meaning through our suffering and pain. It says Paul, we glory in our sufferings. We understand that this suffering we experience can be taken and used in the hands of a God to produce even more glory. And we know this because we see it in the example of Jesus. Jesus, the one who suffered so much he was crucified, but is now the King of glory, has been exalted and lifted up and received all glory and praise and honor that belongs to him. You may not have thought of it in this way, but by nature, I want to suggest that we're glory chasers, that we want to please and we want to be pleased. We all want to please. For some of us, or for some people, maybe the primary person we want to please is ourselves. But we all want to please. Many of us, we want to please those we love. We want to please our spouse or our partner or our lover. We want to please our kids. We want to please our friends. If you're at school, our kids, my kids want to please their teachers. But we also want to be pleased. We want to experience pleasure and fulfillment and meaning. We want to be praised. We want to hear that we're doing a good job. We want to get a pat on the back. We want to know that we're on the right track. We like hearing those good things about us, but we also really enjoy praising others. And the reason is because God made us that way. That's the way we've been made. That's the way we're hardwired. We were designed to glorify him and to be transformed. To become more like him and so become more and more glorious. The point being is if we don't chase this glory, we're going to chase glory elsewhere. We'll seek it elsewhere. We'll look for it in ways that ultimately won't satisfy. We'll reduce it merely to pleasure. We'll find ourselves avoiding pain because for us, as we reduce it, that becomes our maximal experience. You and I, we're glory chasers. We don't need to fight that. We need to have our understanding refined. We need a new paradigm, a new way of looking and living in the world so that pursuit actually produces genuine fulfillment and satisfaction over the course of our existence. Otherwise, you'll seek it in pleasure. We'll seek it in the approval of others. I'm a massive people pleaser, but it will never satisfy. A friend of mine once said to me as he concluded a career that brought with it a lot of honour, he said to me, I learnt as I went through my career that the applause, and in his case, literal applause, the applause of people would never be enough. As he stood there and basked in the adulation and the applause of people, he realized his heart wanted it. He realized his heart would never be satisfied by it. He would always need more. To pursue pleasure and avoid pain is, I think, one of the greatest counterfeits, to go back to last episode. It's the Han van Meegeren of the art world. It's a forgery that looks so good, so close to the original, but ultimately isn't real. It's to pursue a kingdom without a king. So you and I, we were made for glory. We are glory chasers. And the glory of God came through Jesus' suffering on a cross. So the greatest pursuit of your life, the greatest pursuit of my life, is the honor and glory and praise of the one who created you, who loves you, who promises to transform your suffering into even greater glory. And I think that's something worth hoping in. That's something worth believing in. I was made for more than a life of trying to gain pleasure and avoiding pain. I was made for glory, for the honor and praise and recognition, for the love and the delight of the one who made me and who gave himself for me. And so were you. So as I bring this episode to a close, I just want to think practically, right? 3 sort of practical realities of understanding what it means that you and I were made for glory. And I recognize that for some of us at this point, that might be a bit of a stretch, right? But assuming you're here with me, 3 ways, uh, 3 practical realities of understanding that we were made for glory. I think the first one is to gaze into the love of God in Jesus for you. We were talking before about the delight and pleasure that God demonstrated in his Son, for Jesus, as Jesus was baptized. Well, God has that same love and delight and pleasure for you. The songwriter, the psalmist in Psalm 27:4 writes this: "One thing I ask of the Lord, this is what I seek, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord and to seek him in his temple." I heard someone say once, many years ago, people who don't like each other will glance at each other, or people who are indifferent will glance at each other. People who like each other will look at one another. But people who are desperately in love, they will gaze at one another. Can you remember that moment, that time when you first fell in love? Couldn't take your eyes off the other. Hours spent looking into one another's eyes. Time seemed to stand still. People in love, they gaze, don't they? People who don't like each other, at best they'll glance. But people who love each other, they will gaze at each other. Isaac Watts used another word to say the same thing in a famous hymn he wrote. The hymn was called "When I Survey the Wondrous Cross." He writes this: "When I survey the wondrous cross on which the Prince of Glory died." Survey. Now, we might think of a surveyor, particularly when you purchase a house, but in generations past, to survey meant to gaze, to behold, to ponder, to meditate. And he's talking about gazing on the love of God. May God direct your heart into God's love and to Christ's patience. So the first practical reality of understanding we're made for glory is to practice gazing upon Jesus, the beauty and the delight of Jesus. How do you do that? Well, read one of his biographies. See the kind of extraordinary person that he was, that he is. The things that he did, but not just the things that he did, how he went about it, how he loved people, how he drew people in. People that the world said were outcasts, people the world had no time for. Jesus had time for everyone. It's just amazing to read his life and read about his death, read about his resurrection. And the more you do that, the more you come to this incredible picture of just how amazing Jesus is, of how beautiful he is, of how lovely he is, of how gentle he is, of how kind he is. And as you gaze upon him, something starts to happen within our hearts. We start to be transformed. The second practical reality of understanding that we were made for glory, I think, is that understanding that we were made for glory actually helps us grasp even more deeply Jesus' love for you. I think many of us, most of us, are haunted by questions of significance and of worth. Many of us have learned to shut them down, to ignore them, to keep so busy and preoccupied with life that we don't have to think about them. We make our businesses, we make our names, we establish ourselves. I think often not to prove this to others, but to prove to ourselves that we're something, that we're worth something. There are any wounds that we carry that get in the way of knowing and grasping Jesus' love for us? Am I somebody? Am I somebody worth loving? Am I somebody worth noticing? Do I really matter? And so often, as we weigh up the evidence, there's a voice inside our heads that's quick to tell us, no, you're not. There are words in my life, perhaps in your life too, that have been spoken, that have been repeated 1,000 times. Maybe they were spoken just once by somebody else. But our minds have taken that and they play like a recording on our inner thoughts. Stupid, incompetent, ugly, unlovable, worthless. Now the list goes on and on. If I close my eyes for a second and I allow myself to go to that place, those words emerge. Maybe they were said in my childhood. Maybe they were said in my teens. Maybe they were said last week by somebody unthinking, unkind, uncaring. Maybe they were said just once, but my mind has taken them and put them on repeat, on loop, so that they've played 1,000 times. And so somewhere along the road, if we're not careful, our hearts, our minds, we conclude that we're not worth knowing. That whoever and whatever I am can't be much. Maybe our parents weren't there for us. Maybe our friends rejected us. Maybe it was our siblings that received all the attention. Maybe our friends were picked ahead of us. Maybe the guy or the girl that we were interested in never reciprocated. And against this wall of information, I'm going to call it noise. And I'm going to call it untruths. Against this wall of noise and untruths, God continues to speak. He continues to speak out and say, I've chosen you. I've chosen you by my grace. I've chosen you to be a royal priesthood, to be a part of the kingdom. I've chosen you to be my own people. You've been chosen. In some senses, this is what it means when you've trusted in the Lord Jesus to save you. You're also trusting his invitation of welcome to bring you into his kingdom, in which God says, you're mine, you're my son, you're my daughter. Welcome. In Ephesians, a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote, Paul lets us in on a little secret. He writes this in Ephesians 1:8. God chose you before the foundations of the world were set. Now, there's been much said on Ephesians 1 by many preachers. That's not my job today. I just want to reflect on that for just a second and say, we've been more than noticed. You've been more than noticed. That God has pursued you from further than space and longer ago than time. That God has had us in mind since before the foundations of the world. I think some of us, maybe you today, you might have things swirling around in your heart and mind, but I wonder if there's a moment to actually have a heart-to-heart with Jesus. Maybe that's something you've never done before, but just to engage with Jesus and hear what Jesus would say about you. I wonder what you think Jesus might say to you. So yeah, I wonder what it would look like for you to have a conversation with Jesus. I know maybe you're watching this, you're not even sure if Jesus is real, but imagine for a second that he was, and imagine that he was who he said he is, the King of Kings, the King of the cosmos, the one who gave his life for you and I. I think the problem is that we struggle to imagine what it would be like to have that conversation, or we fear what it would be like if we did. That we might imagine that if we would sit down and have a conversation with Jesus, just as friend to friend, that we might discover he's in fact not at all interested, he's disinterested. Can you imagine that? I can. Jesus, here's my life, here's what I'm up to, this is what I'm doing, this is who I'd like to be. and there's Jesus. Well, can you get on with it? Like, I've got stuff to do in Ukraine. There's stuff happening in China. There's a whole lot of people out there doing a whole lot better job chasing me or looking at me than you are. Like, I've got things to do. I've got places to be. I can just imagine that Jesus would be disinterested. He's got bigger fish to fry. For some of us, I think, having a heart-to-heart with Jesus, we're afraid of that because what if it turns out that Jesus isn't disinterested? Even worse, that he's disgusted. You know, like, I'd like to do something with you. I'd like to, love you and be there for you and journey with you and help you get the most out of your life. But, I just can't get past whatever that thing is that holds us up, trips us up. The thing is that the thing that we fear makes us unacceptable. Maybe it's your sexuality, James. I just couldn't get past that. It disgusts me. Maybe it's your temper. Maybe it's your addiction. James, that's gross, man. Like, overcome that already. That's disgusting. I can't even look at you. You're so covered in filth. You're so dirty. You're so unclean. Don't you know that I died for you? Like, honestly, what are you doing with your life? It's just one great big mess. Like, sometimes I feel like we're afraid to come to Jesus because we're going to discover he's not just disinterested, he's disgusted. That he looks at us and thinks, gross. Or maybe we struggle to come and have that conversation with Jesus, share our heart with Jesus, because we think he's going to be disappointed. That's probably the one that hits closest home for me. Jesus, here I am. I love you. I want to follow you. I want to serve you. I'm struggling. And there's Jesus. Man, James, I just had such high hopes for you. Like, honestly, I thought that you and I were really going to get something good done. I mean, you're a minister in the church. You're a minister in my church, for crying out loud. Like, we should be getting here. But honestly, man, like, you're mostly about here. I'm just really disappointed. I really thought you had potential. I really thought you could have made a difference. And the thing is, Jesus has never said those things about us. They're the things that we say about ourselves. What is it that Jesus says about us? You need to hear it again. He says, I love you. I die for you. I gave my life for you. I'd do anything to bring about good in your life. I'd do anything to draw you into the kingdom. I'd do anything for you to receive the glory that your heart is yearning for. In fact, I've done it. Would you believe me? Would you trust me? And here's the thing, right? We've got to come back and we've got to gaze at Jesus. We've got to see just again who he is. Because a lot of us have this conception of Jesus, whether we believe he was real or not, it's imagined. We imagine that God is this big angry judge. We imagine that Jesus is there ready with a blowtorch to fire us up. We imagine that he'd want nothing to do with broken, weak, dirty people that just fall short again and again, that are messed up, and we miss the fact that they're the people that Jesus looked for, sought out, hung out with. One of my special treasures is actually a book that my wife put together for my 40th. I know, who would have thought I am that old? Here it is, Show and Tell. And what's so special about this book is that she went out of her way to find all these people, some of them whom even said they like him. No. She went out of her way to find all these people who love me. And they wrote words here that speak of the things they see in me, the things that are precious to me. When she gave this to me, we were away. We were on a trip without kids for a couple of nights, and she'd set it up and she gave me this book, and she had this great plan that I'd get this book and that I'd open it and I'd devour it, and she'd really enjoy seeing me be blessed, and she'd really enjoy seeing the fruit of all her hard work as I took in and read these kind words that people had said, these things that my friends and family had said about me. Reality was far different. I opened it, I read the first page, realised what was going on, and I cried. It was too overwhelming. It was too much to take on. These kind words were too painful. There's too much in my heart that wants to keep these things at a distance. Because these words that I've spoken about myself over and over, they yell out so loud that to confront them with truthful words is a really painful thing for me. But I got to thinking about it because I noticed that if you flick through the book, you get to the end of the book. You finished with a dog, our dog. But you get to the end, and the last few pages, they're blank. There's nothing there. And, of course, I naturally assumed that was because I didn't have many friends, and Karen had run out of people to ask. Turns out maybe that wasn't the case. But I got to thinking that as these last pages were blank, what would it look like? What would it sound like if Jesus was to take a pen? And if Jesus was to write down what he thinks about me? If he was to fill up the last couple of pages? And here's what he'd say. He'd say, I love you. You're mine. I'm so pleased with you. I get so much pleasure out of being with you. I just delight in you. I've given you everything that you need, and I want to come alongside you, and I want you to know that I'm with you every step of the way. And I'm going to change you. I'm going to keep changing you, because the vision that I have of you is so glorious. What's really there is so precious that I want to see it come out in all its fullness, in all its glory. Karl Barth, a famous theologian, once said, and I'm quoting but probably paraphrasing is close to the truth, who of us sees ourselves as God sees us, and therefore as we really are? Who can say with absolute certainty that he is this or that, the other? And the point that Karl Barth is making is that unless you see yourself as God sees you, you don't really see you. You just see what you think is you. You don't see the real you. And the real you is glorious. The real you is worthy of recognition and praise and delight from God. And God's work, Jesus' invitation, is to allow his glory to bring about transformation in your life, that we might receive and reflect that glory for ourselves. It's worth asking the question, I think, what is it that Jesus would say to you? And if you take a moment, I think you'd be surprised. I think fundamentally, as we look through the Bible, his chief message to you, his chief message to me is, I want you. It's just that so much stuff gets in the way, stops us receiving that. Some of you know that I suffer from severe clinical depression. Something I'm medicated for. It's part of my story and part of my journey. Sometimes it really sucks. But I'm conscious that as I go through life, there's times when I lose grip of what's truly real. And there's times when I just, get really down. I know you've all experienced that. And when I get really down, or when I feel myself going down, when Karen sees that, we have this little code. And she'll come alongside me and she'll say, James, just let me be your mirror. Let me be your mirror. Let me reflect back to you who you really are. That you are kind and generous and gracious. That you are loving. That there's wonderful things about you. And ultimately that you are precious. You are worth something. You are special and you belong to God. And I wonder if there's a moment today, maybe as we finish up, maybe a moment each day, where we can pause and allow God to be our mirror. Allow Jesus to be our mirror, because he wants to be. In fact, we were designed to reflect him. And as we are changed and transformed by him, we increasingly reflect him. I think some of these things help us grasp more deeply Jesus' love for us, for you and for me. That's one of the realities of understanding that we are suffering glory people. We grasp more deeply his love for you, his love for me. Finally, suffering glory people, because we live our lives in an other-centered, loving way, we find, I think, that we place a higher value on relationships and the people around us. One of the realities of being a suffering glory person is that you discover that people, more and more, they're worth fighting for. They're worth forgiving, even though it's really painful. They're worth laying down our lives for. When you understand that you are a suffering glory person, that God has already put upon you his pleasure and delight and honor, simply because you're one of his children, one of his kids, we are freed up to live others-centered lives. So let me finish this episode before we transition into thinking through how the church can be a kingdom that reflects the King in this day and age. Let me finish up by asking the question, who is it that you need to forgive? Who is it that you're tempted to give up on, that maybe you need to re-see as glorious? Who is it that you need to serve? You don't need to make pleasure the ultimate goal of your life. There's something more, there's something greater, there's something deeper, there's something more fulfilling. And friends, we can walk purposefully through pain because we're suffering glory people. We are children of God. We are being transformed by the praise and honor and recognition that belongs to Jesus, that as we focus on is given to us and changes the very nature of who we are, changes how we see the world, how we live in the world, changes everything. Thanks for joining me. It's been good. Can't wait to see you next time.